Hello and welcome back to another video on the channel. It's been a while since I've been able to upload. This is because I am currently in the middle of moving house and have also just started a rather intense new job. But I am now back in the regular swing of things, so you can expect a video or two every week. So what is this one? Well, this is my first opening video. This will be the first in a series of videos that shall comprise my masterclass on the Sicilian dragon. Now, the Sicilian is one of the most complicated and intimidating openings in all of chess, but it is one of Black's best responses. I would go as far as to say it is the best response that Black can play against e4. Let's take a look at what the Sicilian is and how the dragon Sicilian differs from other kinds of Sicilians, and all the separate deviations and branches and ideas that White has at their disposal. So White plays e4 and Black responds c5. Congratulations, you're now in the Sicilian defense. But that, so far, doesn't mean very much, because White here has a plethora of second move alternatives, and there are many, many, many different kinds of Sicilians that Black can play. First, let's break down this move c5. It controls the d4 square, which makes it very difficult for White to play d4 right now, because if they were to play it, we would capture here, and after queen captures on d4, knight c6, this queen is going to have to move. Let's say they move back to d1. This isn't thought to be very great, because Black now has a lead in development. White has spent an additional tempo moving their queen out of danger. We know we don't want to develop our queen so early, so Black's just great here. And this is exactly the same as when Black plays e5 here, which is the second most common response to e4. Well, I mean, in terms of how common it is, does depend on your level, but at the highest level, e5 is the second most common because c5 is by far the most common. We're also controlling d4 when we play e5, but after this same sequence of moves, we hit the queen and the queen returns. Notice that here Black has traded off their e-pawn for White's d-pawn. Not so in the Sicilian, because we played c5, so we traded off our c-pawn for White's d-pawn. What's the difference? Well, center pawns are of more value than wing pawns, typically, because we want to control the center, right? We want to be able to control and dominate these four squares in order to have a space advantage over our opponent, more often than not. And so what Black has said here is, I've traded off my c-pawn for your d-pawn, meaning I now have a 2-to-1 pawn advantage in the center, so long term, these pawns are going to be pushed forward, this pawn is probably going to be eliminated, I'm going to have a center pawn or two center pawns, and you are not, meaning in an endgame, I'm going to fare better, and in the middle game, I'm typically going to have more space. So, in neither of these lines, either e4 or c5, is it very typical for White to play d4, but they can. They can play d4 here, but normally the idea is not to recapture with the queen when we play against the Sicilian and play d4. Usually the idea is to play c3 now here. So after captures, White has now just given up a pawn for a developmental advantage. This is called the Smith-Morra gambit when White plays this way. We won't be covering the Smith-Morra gambit until way late. Maybe it will be an additional video in this course. But this has nothing to do with the Sicilian dragon. But I'm still going to explain to you all of the second move alternatives that White can play, because if you decide for yourself, okay, of all the Sicilians, I want to incorporate the dragon Sicilian in my repertoire, you need to get to the dragon setup. And that's not always going to happen, because White could play a move like d4. Therefore, you will need to have a weapon against the Smith-Morra. But we'll cover that in due course. For now, I just want you to be aware of it. So what other second move alternatives does White have at their disposal here? c3. What's this? This is the Alpine Sicilian. The idea here is essentially that, I don't know, if Black just plays knight c6, I'm going to play this pawn here, and we're going to take, and we're going to take, and now we've actually just traded off c-pawns, because White's c-pawn replaced the d-pawn, and so now White has a big strong center, Black does not, so White stands very well here. So we will need to know how to tackle the Alpine. The typical way of doing it is actually to play knight f6, and after this, knight is kicked with e5. Remember this, because this will become important later. If there's no d6 played here, then White can play e5, kicking our knight. And after something like knight into d5, d4, d6, we can arrive into the kind of main line of the Alpine Sicilian. What else? The b3 Sicilian. This is a setup where white tries to place their bishop on b2. We're now not going to be able to get a dragon setup because white will be faster to control this diagonal with their dark squared bishop. So if we play g6, we will likely lose our rook, or just end up with a horrible position because white will be too fast for us there. b4, this is the wing gambit where white says, come and take the pawn, because now I'm going to take the center, and your whole idea of trading your c-pawn off for my center pawn is now no longer going to work, and if you're not careful, my strong center will be sufficient compensation. A very, very similar idea is a3 here. This is referred to as the delayed wing gambit, because white still wants to play b4. They're just not playing it straight away. They're playing it on their subsequent move. And it's also referred to as the Mengarini Sicilian. So let's say black goes wrong here and plays knight c6. The best move here is knight f6, I believe. White could play b4, and after captures. Yes, black's up a pawn, but now look. c3, the knight retreats. d4, this is definitely sufficient compensation. This center is massive. The lines are already very open for white's pieces. Black is very cramped. They're going to have to play immaculately in order to survive an attack like this. So the a3 Sicilian can be very, very dangerous. If you see a3, for now, just remember to play knight f6. And after e5, again, this idea of chasing our knight, play knight d5, and you should be okay. Okay, so that's the b3 setup, where the bishop comes to b2. That's d4, the Smith-Morra gambit. That's b4, the wing gambit. a3, the delayed wing gambit. What else does white have at their disposal on move 2? This is why the Sicilian is so ridiculous. f4. This can be very difficult if you don't know what you're doing, but actually very easy to refute if you do. We'll cover this in a future video, but it's something white can play. You'll need to be familiar with it. Same with bishop c4, immediately attacking our weak f7 pawn. This is the Baudler attack. We need to know what to do against this. But forget all of those for the time being. Let's talk about knight c3. This is the closed Sicilian. This can lead to setups where white fianchettos their bishop here, or it can lead to something called the Grand Prix attack, where they play f4 very, very quickly, and they start pushing all of these pawns towards our king before we can get castled, and they want to rip the position open and just go for a quick checkmate with ideas like queen to e1, and then the queen comes out to h4, and can get very complicated. But the Dragon Sicilian has nothing to do with the closed Sicilian. If they play knight c3, you're not getting a Dragon Sicilian. What we need white to play is knight f3. This is the open Sicilian. Now we can breathe a breath of fresh air and think to ourselves, right, we might get the Dragon Sicilian here, but we still might not. There are many different kinds of Dragon Sicilians. There's the Dragon Sicilian, which is what we're going to be looking at. There's the accelerated dragon, and there is the hyper accelerated dragon. Here, in this position, is where you would decide which one you want to go for. Sometimes they can transpose into one another, but this move is quite critical, move 2 for black, if white has played knight f3, the open Sicilian. If we're going for our dragon setup, our classical dragon setups, what we're going to be looking at, we're going to play d6 here. If you want the accelerated dragon, which we might look at in a future video, but we're not going to bother ourselves with it too much for now, we want to play knight to c6 here, and very often we'll be met with the Rossolimo attack after bishop to b5. If we want to play the hyper-accelerated dragon, we're going to play g6 immediately, and look to play bishop to g7 very, very quickly. So why these different move orders? Well, in the Dragon Sicilian, black is aiming to play d6, they will usually bring a knight to c6, they'll have played g6 and put their bishop on g7. So you'd have a bishop on g7, you'd have a pawn structure that would look like this, and a knight on c6 to help contest d4. Once all of our pieces are in place, once we've castled in the dragon, we usually want to play d5. Now we've played d6 here, so we know that if we then want to play d5, that's taken us 2 moves, right? Because d6, d5. The accelerated dragon, as well as the hyper-accelerated dragon, delays playing d6 in order to try and get d5 in one go. And that is how they differ, but also because neither the accelerated dragon or the hyper-accelerated dragon plays d6 here, that also allows white certain other options that they wouldn't have open to them were we to play d6 immediately. Again, I'm happy to cover that in a future video if you're interested, but for now we will be concentrating on d6. Are we at the dragon yet? No, because white here can play bishop b5 check. Very similar to if we were going into the accelerated dragon and white played bishop b5 here, although it's not a check. This is an idea, and this is the Rossolimo attack. However, once you've played d6 and there's no knight on c6 and bishop b5 check is played, this is not the Rossolimo attack, this is the Moscow variation, which comes with all of its own theory. We can play knight c6 here, we can play knight d7, we can play bishop d7. I will cover this in a separate chapter. But this is not the Sicilian dragon. This is still separate. We haven't got there yet. How do we reach the Sicilian dragon? Well, more often than not in the open Sicilian, white will play d4 here. And after we capture, because of course we're going to jump at the opportunity to trade our c-pawn for a d-pawn, white will recapture. They will recapture with their knight, not with their queen. They can recapture with their queen. And certain grandmasters are actually playing this way, just to pull people out of theory, dropping the queen back to e3 here. But typically not thought to be a very good idea, because we don't want to be moving our queen so much and allowing black free development. White will always, I can't say always, but should take with the knight here on d4. Now, we want to play knight f6. Now, notice that this knight can't be kicked because we have played d6. So, if white tries to attack our knight here, we can simply capture this piece, and after this knight moves, let's say to b5, well, we can even kick this knight, or we can trade queens first. But the thing is, if we trade queens first, this knight is attacking c7, so we would have to move our king anyway. So why not, instead of trading queens immediately, allow white to be the one to trade queens? Let's kick the knight here, and if the knight drops back, then like, fine, we're going to grab this queen. But if they grab our queen here, yes, we are losing castling rights, but remember what I said, even if we grab their queen, we would need to move our king over and lose castling rights anyway to protect c7. So here, now the knight is simply just being attacked, it needs to drop back, and this pawn is kind of forever ours. We're simply just up a pawn here, and we'll be absolutely fine. Okay, it's not going to be so easy to castle, but in most lines we will be able to hand castle, and the queens are off the board, so the chances of white checkmating us in a game like this are very, very slim. It's likely just to resolve into some kind of endgame where we're up a pawn and simply better. Of course, the knight doesn't have to come to b5. It could go to f3, but then we can trade queens and protect the pawn. And even if they come here to remove the knight, we can just play bishop d7, and after captures, yes, they're winning the pawn back, but now we're snatching their g2 pawn, and even when the rook comes across, once we move the bishop out of the way, we're simply better here. We're simply better. This knight is just silly. We're going to be able to sort of get checks on our opponent's king, and yeah, we're just up a pawn. This is fine. All that to say, this is one of the reasons why we play d6, is because after this pawn is recaptured in the center, we can now just comfortably play knight f6 and not be afraid of e5, because this is covered. So, what white should play here is knight c3. And now we are at a critical branching point in the Sicilian. There are already branches that we've failed to mention, which is that, after the open Sicilian, black can play e6 here. We could broadly categorize Sicilians into e6 Sicilians and d6 Sicilians. If e6 here, you might get something like d4, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, and after knight c6, knight to c3, now we're going to play queen c7, and we're in the Taimanov Sicilian, right? Or we're going to play, back here, we're going to play a6, and we're going to be in the Khan Sicilian. But these are e6 Sicilians, not d6 Sicilians. The dragon is a d6 Sicilian, so if we return to where we were, now knight c3, there are various different d6 Sicilians that you can play here. So knight c6 is the classical Sicilian, a6 is the Najdorf Sicilian, which is thought to be the best Sicilian, the best response to e4 that black can play, but it is also the most ever-evolving, most theory-dense, most complicated opening in all of chess, arguably. So, explore this in your own time. For now, I hope to do videos on it in the future, but yeah, it's extraordinarily dense, and the Dragon Sicilian albeit still complicated, is much, much, much easier to understand. There are other kinds of d6 Sicilians that black has at their disposal here. They can play e5, which is the Sveshnikov Sicilian, but what we are going to be focusing on is the g6 Sicilian, the Dragon Sicilian. All videos in this series will begin with this as our starting position, but I thought that this would be an important introduction because sometimes, you're looking at a chess opening online and they just blitz through the first 6 moves and you think, well, hang on, how have we gotten there? What does each move mean? Why do we play it? Can't white play a plethora of other things? So I hope I've been able to clear up in this video how we reach this position, as well as numerous other things that white can play. So why is the Dragon Sicilian called the Dragon Sicilian? Why did it get such a badass name? Well, there are some competing theories. Some say this looks like a little bit like a dragon's eyebrow in profile, and that when the bishop comes here, it's like the eyeball in the socket. Others say that when the bishop comes here, it's like a long dragon's tail whipping across the board, or like a fire-breathing dragon breathing fire across the board. Others that this looks like the dragon's tail, which is getting closer because the etymological origin actually has to do with the fact that this pawn structure here resembles the Draco constellation. Draco obviously being a Latin word from which we derive dragon. Now before this video ends, I want to give you a brief overview of what each subsequent video will be covering. White has a lot of sound 6th move alternatives. There are moves I won't be covering because they're just garbage. It will be up to you to decipher in your own time why these moves aren't the best. But I assure you that once we cover all of the main lines and the critical ideas within them, spotting a bad move from white will become a lot easier. What are the main moves? Well, here bishop e3 is a very critical idea where white indicates to us that they want to castle queenside. We will be putting our bishop on g7 and castling kingside, so what we will get is a very explosive game with opposite side castling, pawn storms on opposite sides. You shouldn't really be wanting to add the dragon to your repertoire if you're not excited by the idea of extremely aggressive tactical games. Yes, there are more positional motifs that can occur, but typically it's a highly aggressive opening. So be prepared for that. This is called the Yugoslav variation, and we will cover it in great detail. f3 normally transposes into the Yugoslav variation because after bishop e3, white will want to play f3 before they play queen d2. We will look at why in the video on this branch, but just remember it is more precise to play bishop e3 than f3 here because bishop e3 sets a trap for black that we will look at. Bishop e2, the classical variation, indicates the opposite, that white wants to castle kingside here, and we're much more likely to have a quiet game. But this is a critical variation, as is bishop c4, which is unnamed, but I will be referring to it as the javelin variation. We'll see if that catches on. It probably won't, but I like to give lines names because I find them to be very useful memory prompts. So those are all of the bishop moves that are considered to be sound. Bishop e3, bishop e2, bishop c4. You will find bishops of alternative faiths, such as the d3 move and the bishop to g5 move. These are not very good, but I will cover them. There is also g3, the fianchetto variation, so called because white obviously wants to fianchetto their bishop here and castle kingside. It is a critical line, and we will look over it in great detail. And last but not least, and this is what I would recommend as white if you are playing blitz games, f4, the 11-fish variation. Why would I recommend this? This is one of the only lines in the Dragon Sicilian where black does not want to play a quick bishop g7, meaning that if they are on autopilot and playing very quickly and they happen to play bishop g7, they are already in a losing position. It already becomes very, very difficult for them to contend with moves such as f5 and e5. However, if you do know how to refute this as black, it's not very dangerous, and I think black just ends up a lot better. I mean, the positions are equal according to the engine, but I think black ends up with positions that are just a lot more easy to play than white does in these lines. But I think it is uncommon enough to be a dangerous addition to your repertoire as white. So if you're playing against the dragon, and you always play, say, the Yugoslav variation, which is very critical, very dangerous, probably white's best approach, but you want to mix things up and have a surprise weapon in your arsenal, I'd recommend F4, the Levinfish variation. And that is your introductory video on the Dragon Sicilian. So sit tight, buckle up, and be prepared for the next video in the series, which will be Bishop E3, the Yugoslav variation. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you for those that have donated to the channel already via the PayPal link in the description. I can't thank you enough. It really makes doing this a lot easier. Take care, all of you lovely people. And as always, I will see you in the next one.